ICCM presents Diversifying Methodologies in Community Music Contexts, Historical Trauma as a Critical Ally.
I think we should get started. So without any more delay, Te Oti, were you going to introduce yourself? I'm so really thrilled that we could have you. It's our first ever online ICCM event with somebody joining from the Oceania region, and we're delighted that you're, up so early to be doing this for us and sharing some really important insights into Indigenous methodologies and historical trauma through that critical lens for this series. So thank you so much. Would you like to say anything before we share your presentation?
I will unmute. No, I think I introduced myself in the presentation. It's just let me say it's a great honor to be here, and it's lovely to see so many friends from across the CMA network. This is a wonderful opportunity, and for those who have seen parts of this, for those who are coming from colonial contexts, for whom this is not unfamiliar, I would say the point of difference that has happened in community music for me, and just to introduce myself in that way, is that I am Indigenous, but I work in the Western performing arts. So it's a kind of an interesting moment of cognitive dissonance for people like me. But this is focused on research methodologies and just our particular perspective and the scholarship coming from my area. So I introduced myself in appropriately in the presentation. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome and good morning from the South Pacific. As I understand it, the audience here for the ICCM Criticality series will be similar, or at least intersect with the online summer school community music learning, negotiation, collaboration, learning. And so I have deliberately created two presentations, one contextual and macro level, the second more detailed and unpacking the specifics of research design. They have been calibrated to move through the significant key areas in a methodical way, and from my position as an Indigenous academic. Without revealing spoilers for part two, I have prepared an outline for the two presentations so that you can see how they line up. So feel free to take a screenshot of this. These academic offerings nibble away at the edges of community music research. I meander through various discourses, but in totality, through these twin presentations, my aim is to illuminate non-Western perspectives on the function of community music and offer frameworks for more inclusive music research practice. So let's get started. I am an opera singer by training and vocation. At this time, my core business is teaching voice students to appreciate and perform the art objects from that European tradition. That being said, what is relevant to this presentation is that I work in a colonial context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and this is in the South Pacific, and I work also in a university context. I am Indigenous Māori, a descendant of the Polynesian migrants who settled my country before colonization. Through these presentations, I will speak frankly and honestly. I have done my best to support my more provocative statements from the literature. However, sometimes personal testimony bleeds through into my academic writing because I am human and part of a community who are collectively living with the impact of colonization as it is expressed through historical trauma. I find when positioning myself and representing my community within academic forums, I occasionally need to go against ideal practice, avoiding standardized literature, and often I just need to talk my truth. This is one of those times, and I hope you can forgive me if at times my text seems to reflect a generalized account of some concepts. However, it is difficult to illustrate and communicate lived experience to those who are not of the culture. We have seen the world wake up to the historic and contemporary horrors that have been inflicted upon Black lives and people of color. For Indigenous populations in colonial contexts, we have known abuse of power in all its forms. We have known exploitation, we have known hate. We have experienced it historically and in contemporary contexts, visited upon us by police, the military, educational practices, and in quite deliberate ways through the creation of racist policy. This feeds into the Black Lives Matter narrative, not central, but definitely on the periphery. I would like to begin with a Pecha Kucha, first presented in Tbilisi in Georgia in 2018, and consequently modified for 2 more presentations. This version, modified again, I believe offers a background snapshot of historical trauma and the key role of public narrative and who controls this discourse that contributes to the narrative. It succinctly brings to the table some key concepts. Who doesn't enjoy a day leisurely exploring the Louvre, the Prado, the Metropolitan Museum, the Victoria and Albert, museums that contain beautiful objects, noble portraits, sculptures, and other lavish representations of Europe's past wealth and power? A few years ago, I was at Brown University, participating in their International Advanced Research Institute. I was attached to a group that was looking at the development and inequality in the global South. All the researchers were either from developing nations or had an interest in the subaltern or indigenous. A performance artist from this institute was asked to provide a piece for a gala held in the Rhode Island School of Design. He asked indigenous and minority participants from colonized countries to participate, lands historically exploited by colonial forces for the economic well-being of their nation states. It was held in this room. The dignitaries were sipping champagne and nibbling hors d'oeuvres and admiring the paintings. The artist created a runway down the middle of the gallery, and we entered like it was a red carpet event. We walked down the runway and reacted to the paintings on the wall. Unlike these art aficionados, we did not celebrate the beautiful works of art. We cried, we grieved, we screamed, we looked with horror at these public representations of colonial history, and we filled the space with a soundscape rarely heard in a temple of Western art. We created a different type of community music. It was powerful, especially for someone like me who has devoted their lives to the celebration of Western music practices. In this context, however, the objects acted as public reminders of historical trauma, promoting the narrative of the culture of power and in a Foucauldian way diminishing the value of the subaltern's counter-narrative. In our contemporary world, creative artists use their work and celebrity in a more socially responsive way. We Are the World, Comic Relief. They have modern tools at their disposal and can zoom out, if you will, and see the impact of nationhood in a more global context. They are more aware of the people cost of their art making and performing. In other words, if these artists had been globalized rather than imperialized, perhaps they would have provided historical records of their genocides, massacres, forced removal from ancestral lands, residential schools, sexual abuse, rape, cultural suppression, slavery, forced conversions, introductions of disease. This brings me to the notion of historical trauma. In recent years, the term has become a popular trope to describe the long-term impact of colonization, cultural suppression, and the historical oppression of many indigenous peoples. It has been used to link communities' health disparities to traumatic events that occurred through the process of colonization. Much of my research looks at how singing intersects with population health and how communities who have suffered some trauma use these activities to build resilience. As a theoretical model, academics have found historical trauma problematic, as it relies on past causal factors for influencing present-day experiences. They critique these theories by acknowledging that we cannot precisely document what happened in the past. Our knowledge of the past is contained in narrative. Their work problematizes studies that link past traumatic events to present-day outcomes by reminding us that collective memory is highly malleable and a reconstructive process, therefore highly contestable. And so historical trauma has been challenging to quantify in Western academic terms, but as a concept, it manages to capture an important part of the Indigenous experience that other models do not. The conceptualizing of historical trauma as a public narrative offers a solution to the problems of projecting contemporary theory back in time. Contemporary community stories are narratives some scholars consider as the raw materials in the construction of societal discourse. By conceptualizing historical trauma in this way, it offers a solution to the problem of projecting contemporary theory back in time. Researchers have defined narratives as stories that string together events to construct meaning and establish discourse. Important to community music research is that this definition of public narratives extends to include musicking, images, social media, and ideas. I would like to compare the evolution of the public narrative to Dawkins' term meme, which he described as an element of a culture that can be passed from one individual to another by non-genetic means, a unit of cultural transmission which evolves as a gene and undergoes natural selection in the Darwinian sense. Atran extended the meaning of meme beyond that of public narrative and includes word, sentence, thought, belief, dance, and many other cultural expressions. Milner states, memes were a means to transform established cultural texts into new ones, to engage in unconventional arguments about public policy and current events. When I undertake research or creative practice in the community, it is done with an understanding of the social, political reality of that community. This involves finding the time to understand their version of their history, their narratives, and the counter-narratives, the way it has impacted their ancestors, and how this is manifested over the generations. How have the memes been remixed, recirculated, mutated, and evolved by the community and by the culture of power? This is a part of what has constructed a community's identity and can diverge from the academic bubble of mainstream Western thought and the teaching of people's histories. It can be difficult to move beyond these past traumas when public representations and contemporary contexts act as reminders of past losses. Community music plays a significant role in the process, providing a creative space where people can engage with public narratives that promote resiliency. In these moments, we take a step towards healing what Duran and Duran called the soul wound, the collective intergenerational wounding that many Indigenous communities have suffered through their experiences of colonialism. In settler colonies such as ours and all modern nations, where the colonizing forces have not left, these traumas are continuously reinforced by the dominant culture, a culture of power that has created its own account of Indigenous history and its own artificial images of its marginalized communities. You see here a student I will call Student X. He was singing in a proms concert, and for those who don't know, this is of course the British tradition that happens yearly, I think at the Royal Albert Hall. He came to the studio and sang through his selections. He was singing a group of arias, and then announced that they had also asked him to sing Rule Britannia at the end, because of course it's a proms concert and that's what happens. He didn't know the song, but he sang through it with me. He paused at the end of the song and said, I have a few problems with the words. Of course, the chorus for Rule Britannia is, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. Student X thought about it, and he said, I think I know what I will do. So what you see here is the result of that brief consideration of his choices. As you can see, while there is, of course, an overabundance of Union Jack flags, after all, Britons never, never, never will be slaves, the student has taken out a little Samoan flag. The importance of this moment may be lost on some, but for those of us that are searching for the post and post-colonialism, or still trying to access the traditions of the culture of power, this is significant. This is a significant remix of the public narrative that through participatory media became a powerful meme. I would like to show you what happened on social media when he did this. It is not about hearing him sing. It is about hearing the audience response. Another type of community music. That was what I call a Pecha Kucha gone wrong, slightly varied. Anyway, it invited you to consider the following provocations you see on your screen. I fully realized that some of the text was quite busy. So just to give you a moment, we talked about knowledge archive and the superiority of the Western cultural archive, and particularly narratives that sustain this. We talked a lot about historical trauma, and I introduced the concept and particularly the theoretical problems and how we resolve them by considering contemporary public narratives or contemporary narratives. And those can be represented by stories, but also music, images, social media. And then coming to the final summary, the final point really of that provocation is that respectful research is needed, because then you will get authentic representation of those stories. And so feel free to screenshot this as well, although I will talk a little bit more to it. Artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians from Indigenous communities provide diverse examples of creating back against colonial cultures of power that have over the generations occupied our lands of plenty at the expense and exploitation of disenfranchised communities. Alongside this creative art strand, there are Indigenous academics and scholars critiquing historic research practices and education policies that have privileged settler communities and deliberately disadvantaged Indigenous peoples. Researching back involves finding alternative approaches to the conventional Eurocentric practices that have been shown by post-colonial theorists and Indigenous academics to be inadequate for dealing with the legacies of violence that have traumatized their communities. In order to contextualize this literature, one has to understand that Indigenous peoples see researchers as complicit in the design and implementation of the colonial project. It is generally understood by Indigenous commentators that their histories, their knowledge, and the narratives about their ancestors, as reported through the historic discourse about the other, is mostly inaccurate. Gregory Younging links it to the historical colonial practice of transmitting information about Indigenous peoples rather than transmitting Indigenous peoples' perspectives about themselves. These narratives have been archived in the cultural and academic institutions of the West, and is a historic discourse that continues to inform and secure the positional superiority of Western knowledge and its view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge. The pathways to trust, collaboration, and authenticity across all domains of scholarship and practice are complex and historically inscribed. Whether the academic space is post-colonial studies, cultural studies, music education, or community music, the voices that have most often reported stories gathered from Indigenous and marginalized communities are those of Western observers, rather than representatives of those communities. As researchers, we are responsible for the stories we share about the communities we research. Therefore, we need to be sure that the cultural lens is appropriate and endorsed by the researched populations. If Indigenous methodologies do something, what do they do? My question in this section parallels the critique of community music advanced in the keynote speech given at Ismay Baku by Catherine Dean, where she suggested there are some flaws to community music research with regard to evidential rigor. We are not always quite sure what within the community music making promotes specific change. We don't always know what it is that music uniquely or specifically does. I think of scholar Tia Donora in her book, Music Asylums, Wellbeings Through Music in Everyday Life, alluding to this issue from the music therapy edge of the spectrum, asking if music does things in relation to well-being, then what does it do? And how does it do it? What it does? What is the active ingredient? This objective, or the objective of this presentation, is to provide a macro level discussion of the context. And without preempting key information to be delivered in the next presentation, I will discuss this provocation. I start by giving a warning to researchers in any field. Why would participants want to help you? What's in it for them? And I cite the case of anthropologist Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa, a less than rigorous research project that was later challenged, and just to note, so was his critique, by Derek Freeman, who followed her research protocols and re-interviewed participants, reporting that she had been told what she wanted to hear by her less than trustworthy Samoan informants, who were embarrassed by her leading questions about topics never normally mentioned by young girls, least of all to important American ladies. This quite infamous fallout challenged participants' trust and truth-telling, and is an example of negative outcomes from inappropriate procedures. Diversifying research methods is a responsible way to respond to cultural context. It shows cultural humility and respect to the group being studied. More specifically with Indigenous peoples, and this is well articulated across the literature, that we need to accept their set of societal beliefs as legitimate. In practice, this means what they understand as reality, ontology, the way knowledge is formed, epistemology, the values that guide the search for knowledge and benefit the collective, axiology, and by extension, the way we inquire further into their reality, methodology. In this way, what an Indigenous methodology does is provide a culturally safe and culturally rigorous conceptual framework that is not tainted by dominant historic discourses, and with appropriate research tools, culminates in culturally appropriate processes that supports the research, researcher, and researched. This brings to bring this into a community music context, I advise all my students and research colleagues to consider as a reference when shaping their research the questions an ethics committee would ask when assessing the viability of the research processes. And the questions, the viability of the research processes and beneficial outcomes for the community, regardless of the topic. In my experience, it opens new perspectives for research studies where the researcher or the team are the other. So for example, a music education student I had at a PhD level was creating a Braille music curriculum, the first one we have ever had in New Zealand. And she herself was cited. So by acknowledging the protocols that would go into preparing an Indigenous ethics application, she was able to really rigorously dig down into her method and put herself in the perspective of people who are visually impaired, which she had never done before. She just assumed that, you know, she knew what she was doing in this realm. The same thing happens with my students who are working in aging populations, who, especially the ones with neurological conditions, because generally they're much younger. Generally, they only have a theoretical reference for creating research design. So they really value consultation. They really value talking or co-creating research questions. So I include some examples of questions that our ethics committees are asked to consider when evaluating Indigenous research projects. And if answered in the affirmative, then the project is seen to emerge from and align with a Māori conceptual framework. I just leave them there for you to look at and to consider. In the second presentation, I actually give a design method that is what we would call Tika, or correct, and show how I answer some of these questions. But for today, and I'm just mindful of time, I finished with a recommendation. And I assume for some this is not new information. There is value in consultation and co-creation of the research question with people who have lived the experience. Knowing what the communities or groups' aspirations or expectations of that research may be and how they may measure success, so successful outcomes. So I'll leave this with you. You can screenshot this as well if you like. And then just to let you see, the references for the Pecha Kucha are here on this. And I believe this will be archived, so you don't have to worry about doing that. And then I also have some general references. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for your time and watching. Well, Joe, I don't know how you want to proceed from here, but I'm really mindful that that's a lot of information to take in 20 minutes. Some of it quite new, some of it familiar if you're coming from colonial contexts. But I have some provocations, and I know Joe has arranged for breakout rooms to be implemented in a moment. But after that presentation, there are 2 discussion points that I think might be useful. But the first one I would be really keen for you to consider is, at the beginning, you went on Mentimeter and you introduced yourself, as we do, where we're from, what we're doing. I wonder if you want to, in this breakout room, re-examine the position you occupy in your community. And so I'm just going to share my screen for a minute. So I wanted to talk about your position in your community, wherever you live, wherever you work, and consider what team you play for. So where do you fit into that community? Are you privileged? Are you somewhere in your class system or your caste system? What do you occupy? And consider introducing yourself in terms of the socio-political context of your region, if you hadn't already done that. So in your breakout rooms, just consider this. I bring to the table this definition from Lisa Delpit, who wrote The Silenced Dialogue, Power and Pedagogy in I think it was 1988. And this summary is by Barton and Yang, and I always like to bring it back, because even though this is written, almost 20 years ago now, and in fact Lisa Delpit was discussing it even longer, 40, there still has an enormous amount of resonance, because it talks about the cultural powers representing values and beliefs, mostly white, upper and middle class, male and heterosexual, to positions that have control over money. And I think this is eroding gradually, but I find we always circle around to this at decision-making tables. It's always quite interesting, even in our context. Having said that, I'd just like to move into what I like to call, it's a TED Talk, but I'm calling it Te Oti Talk. Just a little bit of a brief, because what's really in my mind at the moment, and I think a lot in the global news at the moment, is that we've just had a election here in New Zealand. And it was a very interesting time for us, because we have been quite prominent in the news in the last few years. We've had a terrorist attack, we've had earthquakes, we've had various, things happening. But we've had a great Prime Minister lead us through this, and she is what we would call centre-left. And so in New Zealand, we have a mixed member proportional sort of representation, MMP we call it, which is based on the German system. So it's designed to ensure that no one power can govern by themselves. There will be no dominant political party. And in this election, for the first time, I believe, our centre-left party is able to govern by itself. And that's never happened before. So the minor parties are in there, but our Prime Minister can form a government by herself with the centre-left parliament, which is very, very interesting for us. However, as you can see in this picture, it is extremely diverse, what we would call super diverse. And I'm going to talk to that. That's what's really made the global news, because what this also signals, if you look at it in another lens, is that our centre-right, which is Conservative National Party, is mostly white, mostly male, very few female, even though the head of it is female, but very few female, very few gay, very few, very little diversity across the board. What we've seen the New Zealand public do is move away from that to what I would call a super diverse group. And I'm just going to read you some according to The Guardian online, I went to The Guardian, this is the most diverse party we've ever had in terms of gender, minority ethnic, and Indigenous representation. Across the parliament, this is the largest number of Indigenous Māori representatives ever in specific seats and general electorate. We have around 10% of the members in the 120-seat House from LGBTQ plus communities. It's making it, what they've been saying actually, this makes it the most diverse parliament in the world. In the news, it's been reported as the gayest, which is fine. That's fine. That'll work for us. The majority of the MPs elected into the parliament are also much younger than previous, and many of them are millennials. And so what we've seen is the departure of many older male white MPs, some who've been in parliament for over 30 years. So I think that's a really interesting culture of power. So this is what our highest decision-making table is looking like at this moment. And it's not been overnight. This has been a long time in the making. We have a good track history with diversity in New Zealand. We were the first to give women the vote. We had the first transgender MP. There are things that have happened along the way that have led to this moment that you see in this screenshot. And I guess what remains to be seen is how this culturally super diverse population that is grounded not only in the contribution recent migrants have make to our community, but also grounded very much in the Indigenous respect of Indigenous cultures. We're not quite sure how all of this is going to filter down to the community level. And in particular, something that I have a great deal of interest in, that is the funding of community music initiatives. So again, to come back to this, if I can go backwards, which I can't. What is the makeup of the culture of power in your region? How does this play out with regard to population health? Because of course, that's been the motivating force for our, if you like, tectonic slide. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, how far it moved to the left. But it is about population health. It is coming out of COVID. It's coming out of other aspects. Do you participate in their traditions? And this is a big part of the sweep also. Just generally, people were not participating in the traditions. Who doesn't participate in those traditions and why? How diverse is the highest decision-making table in your country? Does it filter down to community health and activities? Does it influence or impact funding for the community music activities? And does this funding outcome reflect and represent the diversity of communities in your region? So I wonder if we can maybe go into breakout rooms and discuss that, and then maybe come back, and I might pop in.
Great, thank you so much, Te Oti. There's so much food for thought there, and I personally was very saddened when the decision to not sing Land of Hope and Glory, etc. at this year's 2020 proms was reversed. I got very excited on Twitter when I saw that we might not be singing it this year. Te Oti, just to check, how long would you like for us to take the breakouts? Should we start with 10 minutes?
Yeah, let's start with 10 and see how people are going. Yeah.
I don't know much about academic research, really. That's not my world. But I was very surprised when he shared that his slide of let me just find of the ethics questions. I was kind of going, yeah, surely these are all things that are they any different to any other ethics questions that, you know, why would you have specific ethics questions for this particular kind of research? Because all of these things seem, you know, for whom is the study worthy and relevant, to whom is the research accountable? They all seem to me quite obvious, and I didn't understand why you needed to have a separate set of ethical questions. I suppose but maybe there's some subtleties in all of that that I didn't really understand. So I just, you know, was there something very different in that list?
I'd resonate with that, Pete, and I think that's a really good point. Is that like, you know, I've come to research late. You know, I went to do higher education, approaching 30, and have just started my MA now. You know what I mean? And I've been a practitioner working with music in loads of different contexts for years, and it's that, like, this stuff just seems so obvious to us, right? When you've been working in those contexts, but I think that it's like, especially one of the things I've learned when going through the research is that when some of this is coming from a music education perspective, that there's a lot just tied up in there that, like, that these ideas aren't even talked about and aren't even thought about. And it might seem like, you know, water off a duck's back and second nature to practitioners like ourselves or whatever. But like I think it is good, it's valuable in some senses to go into that as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm very challenged, I think, in hearing our colleagues from post-colonial, or, you know, who are living within post-colonial countries speak about these things, because they are so much further ahead in their thinking and understanding, and the experience is so different. And it makes me realize that, you know, we've, in a way, it feels like over here we've sort of been asleep to some of these issues and concerns, and, you know, that bothers me, because it's, you know, it's obviously so vital that we're talking about and considering these things.
On that, Catherine, I think that's partly like a manifestation of that privilege, you know, of being someone, myself as a white person who's British. Obviously, I've been socialised into thinking my culture and my country is like the best. And actually, I remember going abroad in places and people asking me about my culture and me just having no idea what to say, because, like, it's so dominant, like, and it's just, I've never considered it. It's like that whole thing about, do you consider what your skin colour is? Well, I've never really actually considered or thought about what colour I am until I became like an anti-racism worker and started to think, shit, I've never even thought about being white, because obviously I have never had to. So I think, like, with what Pete was saying before about those questions seeming so obvious, I think as well, we can be quite tokenistic, can't we? So we kind of think we're being inclusive. We kind of think we're including other people's. We kind of think we're being fair and representing people. But sometimes it's a little bit tick boxy, I think, because you can kind of get away with that sometimes. So I think it's about, like, having to dive so much deeper, which, like Emily's saying, is actually quite hard as someone who doesn't have any point of reference whatsoever about what it would possibly feel like to be, you know, that traumatized throughout generations and generations. You know, like I said, personally, I don't have anything to pin that on at all. And I think that's why it's about elevating the voices of those people who do, really. And I guess it's sometimes about thinking, why are we the ones trying to do the research? Why are we the ones trying to lead these things? Because, you know, actually, I'm not sure if I've got anything interesting to say other than maybe facilitating the voice of someone else.
Yeah, and that's something that definitely resonates for me, that idea of how do you, as, you know, I say in my case, a white person with relative power in some cultural contexts, in many cultural contexts, how do you make that space without ending up dominating? How do you facilitate?
I've got a bit of, like, advice here, maybe, because, like, I totally resonate with that as well, because I know how I appear. I could just be the most archetypal middle-class white man in the world, but even my voice, the way I talk, is because I worked in a call center when I was younger. But I'm a first-generation immigrant to this country from a war that our government were waging on their own country, right, in Northern Ireland when we were kids, right? And I come from a Irish traveller background. My paternal grandmother was an Irish traveller, or from an Irish traveling family, and So I remember the British Army landing around in our farm, and us kids getting sent to that and to see what that is. I remember the farm being surrounded in burning fires, all sorts of. I know that this decolonial history is on our doorstep, right? And not just in my work with migrants, it's on our doorstep ourselves, right? And so I think it's like unpacking where we are as well is as important as thinking, in these faraway lands where people that might have represented us went, and we might be living off the back of that. It's like it's unpacking it in our own back garden, isn't it? You know what I mean? And I think that's the most important thing for me with that. Like.
Yes, I think the difficult thing is we live in a environment that obviously we'll have this kind of elitist kind of attitude and that we're better than everyone else, and it's hard to kind of fight through that when there's so much kind of fighting against you. And the question about how diverse is the top power in the country, it almost seems like as diverse as that could be, like the whole ideal of economic growth and capitalism seems to override everything anyway. So we're kind of, and then also the devaluing of arts and culture, and like we're all here because we feel that arts and culture has the voice that can kind of carry these conversations and bring these conversations into the right space and give people the platform and the ability to kind of speak. But if that's all being devalued, then it's really hard to kind of, so there's so many things fighting against the idea of being able to have a balanced conversation on it.
I would say, at least in Germany, music pedagogy and music education discourse has not yet encountered any of these considerations. If so, only like in a very invisible way. I see that in the way that research is discussed. It's less in the way that like there is no critical thought on the production of knowledge, I would say. There is a very conservative vibe in there. So even though, of course, methods are diversifying, I don't think they are diversifying into integrating any other perspective than the own, basically. Quite without any mirror, any idea of my own position in terms of everyone else. Is really, when Te Oti said it like that, the center of knowledge. I think that's very much where music education discourse in Germany still is going.
I mean, and that's interesting. I think one of the things you might be talking about is that the International Society of Music Education has this new group now, and decolonization is central to its mission. But there is clearly a recognition that there are a whole lot of countries that are trying to get on board with this, but it seems like maybe Germany's not one of them. That's what I'm hearing.
Not yet. Not yet. I'm here.
But you're here, yeah.
It's true, because I was thinking at least in the UK, our highest power is very white, very male. And I was very curious from a community music perspective how that translates in your community music groups. And that I guess that struck me as sometimes the most vulnerable people in who the community musicians are reaching out to may not really represent the people in the highest power structures. And if that has any impact in applications for funding or not, would be my question.
Yeah, I think it does, but it kind of like goes even below that. It's like who the practitioners are as well. Like, just in the UK where I'm from, the majority of people doing community music activities are white, and it's and that's having, that has a real bearing on the kind of the participants that we're working with as well. And it's now finally being talked about, I think, discussed, but there's kind of like a real fragility exists within this kind of world as well. You know, we're often freelancers, we're often kind of working from project to project, and to be having those conversations about diversifying the workforce while simultaneously like trying to make ends meet is like there's a tension there, which is quite interesting. And also like, yeah, and you talked about the funding, like I'm just done a report today, you know, and there's lots of tick boxes, you know, tell us about your organization, tell us about the diversity, but where are the real mechanisms kind of there to actually really diversify our workforce and do it in a way that's like caring and for everyone and brings everyone's voices in there? It's really hard in the current climate. I don't know, Nikki, what your experiences are in this area.
And I totally agree. And I think it's been going on for a long time, that conversation that usually a community musician is a white single person and doesn't have kids. I think it's only a recent thing that people having families and being community music has happened as we've got more money coming into it. I think similarly like you, we work a lot with inclusion and challenging circumstances, and that representation on both sides, really. I think what's showing at the moment, and I know it's going back to popular media, is where we've got, if people have caught it, or whether it's just hype, you know, artists being told to retrain. So that we've had all that way through, then, and they're the visible cultural artists and people like that, and then you'll get community musicians probably, I won't say beneath that, because that's very much a status thing, isn't it? But it's interesting paralleling that with trying to access all our work's just on pause because we're not in education. The music service is in education. The community music organisation isn't in education. We can't get back into the schools because they won't have visitors. Yet working with business, the business support, we're not in education, therefore we don't qualify for the business support. We're not in hospitality, we don't qualify. We're not in entertainment. And I think that's quite, I mean, that's probably moved a little bit away from the diversity in the culture of the people. But it's sort of been quite really interesting, reflective on how we're viewed, I suppose. And it's about understanding. I think it's about understanding what we're doing because we're working between the political, the social, the various other agendas, and then the cultural.
Welcome back, everyone. Sorry to those of you that had a short breakout moment, but do we have Te Oti back in the room with us? We do. Hi, Te Oti. So we could spend some time together now and then move on to your second breakout activity if you want.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I was in the midst of a moment of great wisdom when we returned, but I've forgotten what it was. Nonetheless, yeah, if anyone wants to bring to this discussion, I'd love to hear what happened in that breakout room. That we were just getting into discussions because, of course, I brought up the whole funding issue for community musicians. Something we love to discuss, but I was talking about, you know, I'm really going to be curious to see in our system how the cultural power at the decision table, how it trickles down to community music and what is important in community music education. And Nikki was bringing up the point of well, I put it in these terms of public narrative around a community musician. What is the public narrative? What is out there? What is the meme? How does that change things for you when the cultural power changes? We were making the notion that, you know, quite often it's white and single is the community musician person. There's not a lot of diversity there, and you're so busy. I think it was Dave. Yeah, Dave was mentioning about, you know, when you're sustaining a career and a job in this area, you know, that's your priority. And it was a really fascinating thing. And I brought to the table something that I think it was either Joe or Alicia mentioned in the Oxford Handbook. I wrote a piece from the Pacific perspective, and we were talking about how community music, and this really resonates in this gathering, community music for a lot of my students that are of Indigenous and minority cultures from the Pacific is the other. It's like choirs and orchestras and all of those things, and they participate in them, but that's not community music. Their own community music is not their community music, if you understand what I'm saying. Cultural works that sustain traditions and that are made within their communities is not community music. Community music is the things that we inherited from the colonial power, from the settlers. so it's something quite different, and that's just a viewpoint. I mean, it's not everyone for sure, but it was quite an interesting conversation to be had. So if you're Samoan and you're in a Samoan group, it's that's not community music. That's just like hanging out with your family. And so the idea of community for us, and in most specific languages, comes from the word family, comes from whānau, which means family, across our languages. So just even the etymology of the word is slightly different for us when we translate it. Anyway, I'm just wondering if there are other things people would like to discuss from that in terms of diversity and how that decision-making table will trickle down to community music practices. Yeah,
I've definitely got a specific question. So, and this goes back to what I was talking about in that room. So, I gotta give a bit of context. So, the main focus of my work and my research is on using community music to resist the hostile environment in the UK. So, obviously, our government has a very different set of policies to your government about these sorts of things. So, I work mostly with young men from Eritrea and Syria, who are mostly really accomplished musicians in the various traditions, be it hip hop or their own traditional folk musics. But when I've attempted to try and sort of approach the question of building research with them, they're deeply suspicious of it, right? And I think one, because it's coming from these sort of arts-based research methodologies from the academy, not from their traditions, which would be Syrian or Eritrean mostly, and also because they're there to make music, and they're really, sorry, that's my dog. They're really accomplished musicians, and I'm like struggling to work out an ethical practice that we can do research together that isn't just me coming from this university paradigm, and that doesn't interrupt the music making and the paramusical benefits that we always talk about in community music. And I'm struggling with that very particularly. So any insight to that from anyone, I'd really, really love.
Well, I know Deanna's here as well. I think anyone working in a colonial context that's working with Indigenous will be able to provide some frameworks, conceptual frameworks that work for you. But I would definitely suggest, I mean, not that you're dealing with, and it bleeds over into diverse and refugee literature, which I'm not as knowledgeable about. But we do have in New Zealand, we have a lot of also Pacific Western methodologies. You're looking at non-Western methodologies essentially, and they are diverse around the world. To build trust with them is crucial, but it's to co-create the actual project. It's to start from the beginning. And we have this other thing, culturally derived methodologies, where you don't really begin a project until you know them very, very well. And there's this whole prior aspect, which is not, it doesn't.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think this is one of the key points. It's like, this is the inheritance that I'm having to deal with, is I'm already there, really involved in the work and have been for ages. And they know me in that context, right? They don't know me.
Right.
Hey, can I do some weird stuff that isn't the stuff we're doing normally in order to get some data, right? And you got to imagine that most of these young men have walked across Europe, right? And been dealt with the police authorities, and so I can understand that suspicion, and they've got their own, and so it's like there's a step there that I've not been able to step over yet, that is engaging what they want to say rather than necessarily what the frameworks are of the academy or that, and there's some real challenge there that I'm.
Well, I guess the question for me is, what's in it for them? How's this going to benefit them? Why would they help you? Is it going to make their life better? Is it going to make, and that is the problem quite often with academic. It's new knowledge for knowledge's sake, or it's for the academic person doing the work, or it's for their dissertation. But actually, what's in it for them? Have you had that conversation? Because you've got to make them understand that they're
conversation. And
what did they say?
So there's a lot of other challenges within the particular situation that I'm working with. So I've been very basically essentially softer with how I've approached this. And I work in a context that we would define asset-based community development. So we're looking for the people there who are already doing good stuff. And I think that when I try to propose even a lot of these other research sort of methodologies, it immediately takes power away from them in their eyes. and it becomes not about their music, not about, you know, the other, you know, paramusical benefits that we're having, and, you know, all the other, you know, we've had loads of great successes that I could go into another time. But it's as soon as that interruption to the music making becomes about research, that they're, you know, they're smart kids, man. They've managed to get here. They're like, you know, they're between mostly sort of 15, 17, something like that, unaccompanied minors, and like they know the crack, they know that, and they're just, it turns them off wanting to engage with the music making. And so that's that.
So I think it would be very hard to work into that community without having somebody in the community of that culture working alongside you in collaboration. I think it would be really hard. I think that even for me as Indigenous Māori, when I work with Pacifica and our languages are very similar, and I always have somebody from the culture alongside me, working with me into the culture, even though they trust me and they know me and I understand the concepts. I have somebody alongside me working with me. It's collaborative. And then there's a degree of trust. They are looking at you and they see that you look like them, that you, therefore you'll probably think like them, that when they say something, you're going to understand the concept at a deep level, not at a superficial level, at a deep level, because you have that lived experience. So you need to, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say you need to, but I would say the first step to building up trust with any sort of community is to have somebody alongside you who has that lived experience, who knows all of these things.
I know what you mean. I'm already doing that. This is the thing, you know what I mean? I'm already halfway done. I thank you though for your advice. That it's a hard problem. No one's come up with like it's a very particular context, but I appreciate what you're saying, and like I'm trying on.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it, and I do think the refugee context is quite different. I mean, I think it's they have a whole different set of trauma to deal with. They have a whole different set of trauma.
We have trying to unpick and connect with this, what you're calling the historical trauma, which I think is really critical to do as well, from my perspective as someone from the dominant society. But it's the immediacy of the trauma of these young men, really. That's the barrier.
Yeah. It's very contemporary. Yeah, no, fantastic. Yeah, no, really good work. Persevere, because I think there's a lot that will come out that will be very helpful for us from your work in this area. Yeah.
Te Oti, we could continue the conversation as a whole group now, or we could move to breakouts again. It's just gone 8:05, so we've got about 25 minutes left on the call. It's up to you. In our breakouts, we could either go to your second discussion point, or people might want to continue reflecting on the first points that we've put to the groups. It's up to you.
Well, I think I'm really curious in the second discussion point, which is, and actually Rory sort of touched on it already. It's just what we've done today. How is this going to impact your work? How can it impact your work? What would you learn from the discussion points today, and where is that going to take your research? Is there some new way of looking at it? I suppose that's interesting for me because I live in a context where we have to do this all the time. It's standard protocol. It's very new. And when I go into various global community network moments, there's varying degrees of this knowledge and this perspective. So I don't know if that's useful for people to talk about, because that is kind of what Rory was touching on. It's like, how is this going to help me? Well, what are the potential aspects of this? So if I was to come back to my breakout slides, the point that I would be asking would be, will this presentation impact the way you research or practice community music? I guess that's my question.
Great. So should we launch back into breakouts so that people can talk about that, and then maybe we come together as a whole again, and you can share some of your small group discussions. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
So I'm a master's student and I've just come out of university, and so I'm kind of pretty new to this whole kind of mind-blowing realization that what I've been taught up until basically now has been really deeply rooted in colonialism. So my practice involves, at the moment, like it's really early days and I'm still developing it, but I volunteer for teaching gamelan, and with Emily Crosland, who's actually on the call as well. It was nice to see her. And also I do a bit of samba facilitation as well. So I've had these realizations that like my positionality as like a classically trained Western white musician, I'm having some issues and some tensions, like negotiating my positionality and thinking like kind of, well, what right do I have really to kind of use these mediums as part of my practice, kind of thing. And I don't really have a solution for this yet. This is just kind of me kind of existential crisis at you.
and I think, thank you very much for sort of sharing that struggle, because I mean that it's interesting to challenge it. Has anyone got any responses to that?
Maybe just something that adds to that. Thank you so much, Emily. I'm always going back to this question of repertoire as well. You know, I've been doing lots of projects with young refugee children in shelters. And obviously it's always a question, so what do you do? What kind of songs, what kind of pieces do you do? And it's just a question that I keep having, is like, is it okay to use a song from Ghana? Nobody, you know, on that circle has been in Ghana, possibly. I haven't been in Ghana, but I like the song. So I'm using the song because it has a good vibe. So how much is that cultural appropriation or not? So these questions are, for me, they are present. And I keep kind of, for myself, for my own well-being, I kind of go back to, well, I'm a musician. And musicians have always shared songs. They have always swapped and traded melodies. And they have, you know, taken from here and given to there. And so I kind of place myself into that kind of tradition. I kind of place myself into that line, as I'm not going to own it and I'm not owning anything, but it's more like a possibility of sharing and just, you know, developing onwards. But that question keeps coming. And I notice my own negligence. I don't know if that's a real word. Is that a real word? Yeah. I keep inventing English words, so sometimes I'm not entirely sure. But so something like, I realize that my consciousness about this topic has risen in the last, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years, but I've been practicing this for the last 20. So I noticed that many songs, I actually don't know exactly where they're from. I don't know exactly the language that I'm singing. And this has been something that I have started to kind of rebuild my knowledge and re-educate myself about that. But I still sometimes, I'm in a workshop, I'm singing this song and I think, damn, I don't know the language. You know?
Yeah, so I love that. What you said like, I want to share it, but not own it. I like that. I'm just gonna that stuck with me.
Thanks. Effie, I know you wanted to say something, but it looked like you were mute.
I was thinking while listening to all of you and to what has been said previously, I'm actually guilty of, in a way, reproducing colonization, because as a member of a municipality choir, there's a professional municipal choir in Athens, and among the varied things that we do some community work, singing, you know, for the underprivileged, but we're always using Western repertoire, sometimes Greek music, but we have never challenged, you know, what kind of material we were using. And one of the activities we had, for which I have been also responsible in a way, is educating young people that come to our concerts to understand how a choir works. But all of that has been based on the perception of Western choir, singing Western repertoire and discussing the soprano, the alto, the tenor, the bass, polyphony, harmony, briefly and quite simply. But, you know, and this is not our culture. This is not the Greek culture. Choir singing is not part of the Greek culture as it is of the English or the German. So I'm in a way guilty for, you know, actually sharing colonization, because I'm using this very strongly centered repertoire, that this meeting has challenged. And yeah, this has put some, and yeah, also appropriating African repertoire, whenever I try that, without really understanding where it comes from, what it really means in the community where it was generated, is another danger. And all of those things are now banging in my head, and they'll keep me awake tonight, I think.
And I think some of these ideas are to challenge us, but not for those of us that are maybe, maybe we're running Samba group and we've not been to Brazil, and I don't think there's a sense here that one shouldn't be doing that. I think it's just a kind of, for us, in those cultures of power situation, for us, for maybe to reflect and think, can we do something different? I mean, I think that would seem a really positive thing to do. I always think community musicians in the United Kingdom have a history of using musics, and maybe the word use is correct, or engaging in musics of other cultures. And I often think that that's because, to some extent, it can be a useful tool because it comes potentially without the baggage of a music culture where a lot of people that would engage in community music would want to have been, I suppose, beaten down by, not allowed to be involved in this type of music, but this type of music kind of doesn't come with a baggage.
I think there's a range of attitudes, inevitably, really. I know that some musicians from the African diaspora, whichever country, are very, very, no, this is a Ghanaian rhythm. And it could be the same rhythm that occurs in another country, but they are very protected. This is definitely a Ghanaian rhythm. There are other attitudes that they will love you to play their music. If you do well, they'll celebrate it with you. They'll love you for it. So it's a whole mixed bag, really, I think.
Yeah. I have one thought, and it's like, I need to say it, which is that I think the concept of ownership is probably a very Western concept. We think music is owned by a group, but maybe this is not how Indigenous people would look at it at the first place, because we're just kind of used to owning everything. We're buying it and then we own it.
In terms of the influence, I think it's regardless of what area of community music you're in, or I think this is a key issue anyway. I think that there's been talk about the context of working with groups that are from post-colonial countries, or like immigrants, or but it, in a sense, we all need to take the responsibility on to kind of have these conversations with whoever we're engaging with, and talk about what our culture is, what other cultures are, what's appropriation, what's appreciation, what's so.
Yeah, I'm not from a research context either. I work for Bernardo's, I work with vulnerable young people. I'm not actually even a musician at all. I kind of found myself in this role, and I'm just learning and developing my knowledge of music as a tool. So I kind of joined just from a pure, I'm interested in this area. So I think it's strengthened my perspective that, nothing about us without us, but kind of really made me realize even more about how skewed everything we learn is, and how hard you have to work actually to even try and see the truth, and just fight through the colonial influence and fight through the racism to really try and actually see the truth and seek out those opportunities. So yeah, I think it's just kind of motivated me more to make that a priority, and also give me some ideas of more stuff to read, which I think will improve my practice.
And I guess the other side of my work that's on my mind through this is I do a lot of work in prisons, and again, there have been discussions with some of the organisations I work with about
people with lived experience of being in prison, and how are those voices and perspectives represented? You know, how do we constantly make sure that we're not doing music at people, but instead, you know, genuinely making space for different voices and different ways of doing it. And I think, I don't know, I think I just find myself constantly baffled by what gets talked about as music and as music practice in a lot of the culture. You know, I'm attached to a university, but I'm not an academic myself. I'm not a researcher. And just hearing the way people talk about music and the assumptions made about music from other cultures. So yeah, busy brain, as you can probably tell from that ramble, but lots to think about. What about you, Catherine?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, Emily, because I know that, you know, thinking about, particularly in the context of working and also researching within a prison, and actually I was working with our master's students today, and one of the questions I was asking, and I'm just trying to find it. It was basically like the idea of, you know, people's traumatic experiences becoming your kind of gateway to, you know, self-gain and those kinds of things. And it was really so challenging to think about that in the context of what I do, not just because of the work that I do and the practice that I'm involved in, but because of the research side of it, where there is potential for talking about and writing about and presenting about that project to, in some way, shape or form, bring personal gain to me, whatever that looks like. And so there's a kind of a really complicated question that I need to think about a lot more carefully, and also in terms of, you know, the representation of voice. And there's an amazing podcast by a PhD researcher she's in Glasgow, and she works with an organisation called Vox Luminis, who do singing and songwriting projects in prisons. And she's asking, you know, similar questions. She's working with people with lived experience of forced migration, and she quotes from one of them, which is, you know, everyone wants to know my story, but nothing ever changes. And so I think there's a kind of, it's not just a challenge for us, but it's actually a really kind of serious question that we need to be asking ourselves in both our practice and our research is, you know, if something doesn't change in the telling of those stories, you know, if that narrative doesn't change because of what we're doing, then, you know, are we doing the right things? Are we doing the right things in the wrong way? Is there more that we could do? So it's those kind of questions, I think that's
yeah, you've got to consider the re-traumatization as well. Like I was thinking that, Rory, when I was thinking of your work, you know, you've got to maybe really ask the question, is the research appropriate, you know, with that group at this time?
Well, this is it. It's like it's I can't ethically say I can make it safe to do it within the frameworks that I've studied and come across so far. You know what I mean? And I'm really struggling with that. You know what I mean?
Hi everyone, I'm really sorry to have stopped your conversations early. It feels like the most horrible job, this, stopping people from having the most interesting conversations. And especially when I joined your group for a little while and I really wanted to join in and and offer something and respond. So I'm very sorry about that. But Te Oti, I feel like maybe that's a great idea. Maybe if you want to begin with pulling out some of those threads from your group by Kevin, talking about that, if that's okay for you, Kevin.
Oh, for sure. Because I think what I found really interesting about, I mean, because we hadn't gone much into Indigenous, and I hadn't realized there were quite so many people who had been to New Zealand. There is something about engaging with this from a distance, but if you're in the land, you're so connected to it. And we were talking a little bit in about the ecological components of his work and place, really. And so, Kevin, are you there? Do you want to talk a little bit about how this impacts your work? And of course, you've been to New Zealand, so.
Yes, yeah. So I had my research is around bringing an ecological philosophy to community music practice. And what I found is, like Te Oti said, I had spent some time. I've been to New Zealand a good few times. The first time was way back 15 years ago, and I had become interested in. I didn't when I was talking to Te Oti, I didn't have the confidence to say the word kaupapa because I wasn't sure I was going to pronounce it right.
Kevin, I'm sorry to stop you there. Zoom is not allowing me to mute participants, which I normally can. So can you please mute yourself, everybody, because there's some interesting sound on the call. I'm having a really lot of glitches tonight. I've not been able to private message, and now I can't mute people. So, Kevin, we really want to hear what you say. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So basically, the thing is that it's indigenous views around nature and the interrelationship of everything that is like finally sort of Western philosophy is coming round to that idea, and scientific consensus is coming around to that idea, and in fact legislation is coming around to that idea, because one of the things we discussed was the rights of nature. Giving legal personhood to rivers and mountains and perhaps even soil or something like that. That might be an effective legislation for kind of meeting our carbon targets and all that. And it's coming directly from Indigenous philosophy, particularly an Indigenous ontology of like everybody exists only in relation, in terms of relationships. And nothing exists sort of for anything else. I think that's what I said.
No, super, thank you. I just wanted to, we don't have a lot of time and I want to make sure everyone has time to speak. I noticed Joyce, how are you from South Africa? Lovely to see you popping up on chat. You had some really interesting things to say. Hi, how are you? Lovely to see you.
Yeah, cool. It's really nice to be here. As always, it's always such a positive learning experience from everyone.
Did you want to speak first to your comment about Rory? Because that I was also rethinking that in terms of, I think something quite interesting in terms of the age of that group also, which I think is interesting in terms of research. But you were mentioning something around resistance.
Our group, I was with Prita and I forgot her name now. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. But anyway, we discussed how the the resistance that Rory faced and the challenges that comes with getting people into his research can maybe also be a research topic in itself. And that's what we meant, like in connection to outcome driven, maybe the fact that they're maybe not so keen to participate in the way that he wants them to, maybe that's also an indication of how he can maybe change his research. In terms of methodology, I was thinking like maybe, like there's some very interesting arts-based methodology that might be more attractive to this community, but like I think it's very nuanced and depends. I don't know.
Yeah, no, very interesting. Thank you. And you're also talking about trauma-informed practices and methodology with Catherine and I are both on a trauma book coming out shortly. And I'm really curious, how would this discussion today, Catherine, I'm sorry, just directing at you, Catherine Birch, how would this impact your work, if anything? Could it, can it? Doesn't have to, but.
Yeah, do you know what, Te Oti? We've just been having a really interesting conversation about that. And I'm so grateful that you've raised these issues for us because, in the context of working in the UK, there are things that we are very behind in our thinking about. And I think what was coming up in our discussion with practitioners in that group working in different contexts. So we had Rory in that group, we had Liz in that group who works with Bernardo's, which is a UK-based charity supporting children and young people in really challenging circumstances. And we had Ken in that group, and also Emily Crossland, who works with Javanese gamelan. So for her, there was a lot of questions around thinking culturally about what she's working with in terms of her musical tool, but also she works with good vibrations, working in prison settings. So we were kind of thinking about those contexts. One of the things that came up that actually is similar to Joy's suggestion was in conversation about how we work with our, not just our participants in terms of musical participants, but with our research participants, if that's what we're engaging with as well, that actually those trauma-informed frameworks could be really useful to think about creating that safety net, making sure there's choice at every step of the way, making sure that it's a really collaborative process, building up of trust, which I know, Te Oti, you were talking about earlier on. And also that sense of empowering of people's voices. And there's a lot of questions, I think, for us about how to do that safely and how to do that ethically, and particularly when you're working with people you know have experienced trauma. It's those considerations around not re-traumatizing and not working too closely with trauma narratives. So there's a lot of considerations there, but it could, and I think as the conversation went on, we were thinking there could be something useful in using those kind of trauma-informed frameworks in a research sense as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. That's amazing. Thank you. I'm mindful of the time, Jo. Jo, do you want me to just speak very quickly to Dime, or?
Absolutely. I was putting my hand up to make a comment about the
Sorry.
conversation, if that's okay.
I thought you were telling me to stop. Okay,
Oh,
cool.
I know, that is normally my job, and I'm very sorry. It's not a job that I enjoy. But no, I was just thinking about Joy's conversation in the chat, responding to Rory's kind of provocations and challenges that he's having with his research in that context. And then I've seen Liz Bennett and also Catherine mention the re-traumatizing, the concern not to re-traumatize through research. And I'd be really interested to think about the research question and the ways that that can be co-created with the groups that you're working with. Because if I understand Rory's context a little bit, I don't know Rory's context, but Rory mentioned that he's worked with these groups for a long time, and I appreciate that those people that are refugees, for example, are transient. But if you do have a developed relationship with a particular group, it might be an interesting starting point to think about co-creating the research questions, if that's something that, if the research is about driving the practice between you. So that was just something that I'd be interested in talking more about another time. But yes, Te Oti, you're right. Time is moving forward, and we're now technically at the end of our call. But I think it would be great if everybody was happy to stay on for a few more minutes to allow space for any final responses. But for you to talk about Dime would be wonderful.
Okay, so I'm not sure, can everyone see this? I think you can. I just wanted to, in the last few minutes, just bring your attention to DIME, which is Decolonizing Indigenous Music Education. It's a special interest group, and some of you may be aware of it or not, but it's a part of ISME, and I wanted to speak to it a little bit because it was proposed last year. And I found it fascinating because it took me back to CMA, and it took me back specifically to CMA Corfu, where I first joined this network. And I was talking about specifically kapahaka. And I talk about that in the second presentation. But when they asked for responses to whether they felt this special interest group should be a special interest group, my response was, well, is there currently a culturally safe place for Indigenous peoples and their allies to gather and discuss their issues within the ISME collective? And it was a rhetorical question. I answered, I said, well, if you're going to look for an answer, it needs to be from someone who is Indigenous and participating through their experience of ISME, can respond. And so with that, I responded, because I am. And I said, no, I really didn't think there was. And I think this was a timely moment to promote this sort of special interest group. And as a consequence of that, we've been very busy this year doing that. And I put the mission up there of the group. And while I feel it connects most strongly with community music, that's probably my bias, it has great uptake across ISME. And at the moment, my role in it has been to set up an Indigenous steering group. And we have a group that includes academic practitioners from Chile, who are Mapuche, South Africa, Sami, First Nations, Canada, First Nations, Australia. It's quite a diverse group. And I think that's a really interesting, might be interesting for some of you to engage with that special interest group. You can go through the ISME website and find us. We have just put a call out for chapters, and Rutledge is quite, I think, I'm not sure if Jenny Henley's there. Rutledge is quite curious and enthusiastic about an edited chapter from us. We have put right up front that this chapter needs to be co-written with an Indigenous person. And our goal is that eventually the books are coming out and they're only from the Indigenous viewpoint, or a lot of the chapters are, and that we act almost like a pan-tribal reference group, if you like, for ISME, because I think in many ways we're a long way behind many other disciplines in terms of decolonizing our practices. And it's we still celebrate and uplift the Western traditions more often. So it's an interesting space to be in at the moment. I'm finding it very interesting to be on this group. I was not on the founding group. I came on. And I came on because there were no Indigenous people on it. And for me, this is all about making sure that protocols are in place and these perspectives are being seen at all levels of decision making. So I just wanted to mention that, Joe. And if you're doing anything or writing anything at the moment that might fit into our call, please have a look at the call on the ISME site.
Great, thank you so much, Te Oti. I think I've shared a link to the section on the ISME website that people will be able to find some more information out there. Thank you so much for this event. We are coming to a close. The final bit from me is to say that if you're interested in any more upcoming ICCM events, you can find them on our website, and that information will come in the chat soon. We also have some brilliant master's students at York St John University who are beginning to galvanize some social media. So many of you that want to continue conversations, there will be activities happening on the ICCM Facebook and the ICCM Twitter. Previously that hasn't been so active, and that's really because of capacity, but with some brilliant people on board supporting that, you might want to connect in there and have some conversations. So yeah, we have some upcoming events coming soon. Our next one is on the 12th of November, and that will be presented by Kim Bereskoff on community music, the potential of it as and being an ambiguous practice, both transformative and potentially reproducing, taking our theme of criticality a little further. And I think that's it from me, except to say that we will share the recording of this with you all. If you're on the ICCM mailing list, you'll receive a notification of that. And if you'd like to join the mailing list, there should be a link to that coming up in the chat too. But finally, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on your early morning in Auckland, for getting up super early and being with us, and for sharing some really insightful provocations and questions that I certainly will take forward with me, questions that need more thinking and would warrant more time. So Te Oti, thank you. I kind of want to give you a round of applause. Anybody that's with me, I think we just have to imagine that we're all together somehow. Brilliant. And I think that's it, unless anybody else has anything else to say. Thank you very much. We'll close the call, but if you're Te Oti or an ICCM team member, you're welcome to stay on. Okay. Good night, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all. Bye.